gonna just say a few words, and then I'm gonna pivot to you. Chris Fox, and then this is an introduction of Dr. Winfree, who, as you can see, he's actually I didn't realize, Dr. Winfree, that you went to high school here in North Palm Beach, Florida. So you're a Floridian to some extent, and also after that you went northeast away from Dartmouth, Columbia, for medical school residency, and then you stay there up in the New York area, of course, where you have been doing beautiful work, and I've been following your work since I edited the first edition of Schmidt and Sweet myself, and you've been very kind and generous with the work, with collaborating with us in books and chapters and papers and doing all kinds of stuff. Multiple awards that you can see. We just put the latest ones right here. He has been recognized as one of the New York's top doctors by the magazine, and he's gotten multiple awards in his work and painting. You'll see that the topic today has to do with opioids, and I think that we have a tremendous opportunity for us to collaborate. A lot of publications as well, as you can see. Then we track his NIH index, which is what we do, Chris, Dr. Winfree, with all our faculty and our residents. We get them into the getting used to seeing what their impact is in the literature as well, and we try to do that for our faculty as well. So I am going to stop right here. I'm going to ask Dr. Fox. Dr. Fox, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Q. Good morning, Chris. How are you? I was very excited to see Dr. Winfree on the list of speakers. I've known Chris for a long time. I'm sorry to date you, Dr. Winfree, but when you have some of the best hair in neurosurgery, that's very difficult to do. So I met Chris back in 2002 when I was a sub-I at Columbia. He was a chief resident, and since that time, he's continued to just be an amazing friend and leader. We worked together at Columbia for a couple of years, and I got to know him even better. Not only is he a world expert on neurosurgical pain and all around fantastic neurosurgeon and great guy and partner, but what you may not know is he's also an expert on food. He can tell you pretty much anything you want to know about any exotic food anywhere. So if you need a recipe for blowfish, he's the guy. And on top of that, he's also an explorer and an adventurer. He spent time solo in the Arctic and is also a cave diver. Grew up in Florida, as Q said. So I'm sorry that you're not able to be here now in person, because I'm sure you would be pairing that with some cave dives, elsewhere in the state. But Dr. Winfree really is a fantastic person, fantastic neurosurgeon. His patients love him. He was well known all around the New York City and tri-state area, the go-to guy for many conditions. So it's an honor and a privilege to have him here this morning to share some of his experience with us. So Chris, welcome, and thank you for coming.
All right, Chris, thank you. That was absolutely the best introduction I've ever had, bar none. Everyone can hear me and can see the screen, right? Yes,
we see you. We hear you very well, Dr. Winfree. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Q. And it's an honor to be part of your organization today. And you guys have done a really wonderful job in getting your residents out there and being productive and being the face of neurosurgery. It's really it's quite a series of accomplishments you've put together there. I do wish I were there in person. When I do these visiting professorships, I've done a bunch of them. I normally teach a peripheral nerve cadaver course, and I don't know if it would be in your sim facility or not, but it would have been neat to see the facilities there. I know you guys have done a lot of work putting together a remarkable world-class facility, and maybe one day I'll get to visit it, before I retire. But a cadaver course for the residents would be the thing we would do there. As you mentioned, I did grow up in Florida, Jupiter, Florida. You can see it on the map here, a little south of you. And, they say you can take the kid out of Florida, but you can't take the Florida out of the kid. So that rubbed off on my son, who also is at heart a Floridian. And this is how he keeps tabs on the neighbors. He is the kindest soul ever and would never hurt anybody, but man, he loves his guns and he loves checking out people with the rifle. And he says he wants to be a heart surgeon, but it wouldn't surprise him if he ended up being a sniper. So Florida was a great jumping off point. As Chris mentioned, I cave dive and spent a lot of time going to the Bahamas, and you know, there's a lot of deep dark holes there. And I know Q, you have a whole story about how you were trapped in a hole of sorts in that petroleum storage tank. And I gotta, when I meet with you later, I'm going to tell you a story that's it's not the same. I mean, your story is within the context of an amazing personal you know, story and adventure of, you know, sacrifice and ambition and everything. Mine's more of just a couple of knuckleheads from Florida got stuck in a hole, but it's still harrowing nonetheless. And I think you might enjoy it. And we'll talk about that later. A shout out to Eric and Chris, buddies of mine from the NSA. And like you said, you know, like he said, Chris and I worked together as partners some years ago, and it was a pleasure working with them. And Chris is one of those guys where, you know, I got to be near greatness. Like I've never really been that good at anything in my life. And I remember when Chris showed me a picture when they won the NCAA championship in Michigan in hockey, and that's very cool. To be the absolute best at something is pretty remarkable, and that's a neat thing. So today we're going to talk about the opioid crisis. I wanted to give folks a break from COVID. I'm only going to mention COVID briefly. I know that's from a healthcare perspective what pretty much everyone's been talking about, and we're not really going to talk about it too much. This is going to be the only slide about COVID. And it's just to illustrate that 2020 was all about this. And I want to talk about something different. Remember before COVID, Kobe Bryant, you know, things in 2020 that happened before COVID took over the world. Australia burning, Donald Trump, Meghan and Harry, which incidentally, you know, Trump and Meghan and Harry still crop up in the news today. But this is what was going on pre-COVID. And from a healthcare perspective, the other thing that was going on before COVID was the opioid crisis. And this really consumed America and American press and attention really before COVID. This is what was on the news. And I want to explain sort of what it is and sort of what our role as physicians and neurosurgeons have been throughout this crisis. Give you guys a sort of a different perspective on this. So the opioid crisis is thought of as a pervasive conspiracy of multiple seemingly beneficial steps, often driven by physicians, right? So it's a series of things that a lot of people contributed to, including us. When I say us, I mean doctors. And if you're interested in this is a great paper to read if you're interested in this topic. So I'm going to talk about the crisis itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about neurosurgery advocacy and wrap up about something about so my impression of functional neurosurgery and how, as functional neurosurgeons, we can play a role at leading us out of this crisis, and to give your residents and fellows some sense of sort of how you can contribute with your careers moving forward. So hopefully this will be helpful for developing a new perspective. So it helps understand some history. The prehistory of the opioid crisis dates back to the 1800s and 1900s. There's really no regulation regarding a lot of these controlled substances. Opium, morphine, heroin, cocaine, these drugs were widely available. They were available to anybody. They marketed them directly to the public. I mean, this is mother's little helper, right? If you've got screaming kids, give them some opium, right? Or if you can't sleep at night, take some heroin. I mean, it's crazy. If you need to wake up in the morning, snort some cocaine. This is what people were doing with their families in the 18 and early 1900s. There was aggressive marketing. You know, people were making money on it, and it was terrible. And as you can imagine, with this unchecked supply, you had this rise of addiction in opioids, opium, heroin abuse, the whole thing, and people were dying, and it was bad. And so in response, what you're going to see, the theme here is this pendulum that swings one way where you have horrible abuse, and it swings another way where you have all these restrictions, and it swings back and forth. And that's just a reflection of human nature. So what happened in 1914 is the passage of the Harrison Narcotic Control Act, which really outlawed a lot of these drugs. And it really introduced a sense of opioid phobia, or a sense that these opioids, which are actually useful drugs, are actually dangerous and you should not give them to patients. So anybody who had pain, regardless of the etiology, was considered to be a malingerer. And even people dying of cancer, just horrible, painful cancer deaths, were denied adequate or any pain meds whatsoever until just their final weeks and days of death. And it was just brutal and it was horrible. And that's how a lot of the 20th century went. So middle of 20th century, doctors started to think about, you know, is this really the right way to do? And you start to see the pendulum go in the opposite direction. So there's this call to use narcotics for patients in treating pain. And then at one point you have this really a key event, if you will, is the publication of this paper. And I say paper is really a 1-paragraph letter to the editor by Porter and Jick. This is what provided the evidence base for late 20th century opioid prescribing. They basically looked at 39,000 hospitalizations, 11,000, almost 12,000 of whom got a narcotic prescribed during the hospitalization. And they documented 4 people ended up with opioid addiction afterwards. So by their calculations, if you take opioids, you've got a 0.03% addiction rate or risk of addiction. 1980, this was published. This was the evidence, right? This is not a paper. This is not peer reviewed. This is literally a couple sentences in a high profile journal. But that's what happened. People started to think, when I say people, doctors started to quote this as, if you prescribe opioids, your patients will have a vanishingly low risk of getting addicted to the drugs. So that set the stage for subsequent efforts by the World Health Organization in particular. 1986 developed a methodology for treating cancer pain using opioids. Basically, they constructed this strategy where you start off with either non-opioid medications or weak opioids. And if you don't get pain relief, you escalate up to stronger and stronger drugs until the patients get pain relief. So this strategy became translated into multiple languages. It became used worldwide to train doctors in treating cancer-related pain. And it formed basically the basis of opioid education. And this became the WHO, or the World Health Organization, treatment ladder, right? And this is still in use today, both in cancer pain and non-cancer pain. And so doctors saw this and were like, well, we can maybe do this for non-cancer patients. And so you start to have this push towards treating non-malignant pain. So pain that has nothing to do with cancer. And you have prominent pain physicians, including Dr. Portnoy here in New York City, saying opioid maintenance therapy can be safe and humane. So they're appealing to doctors' better instincts, like treat these patients in pain. It's a humane thing to do, and feel free to use opioids because they're safe. Again, more papers, prominent journals, tragedy of needless pain, right? This isn't just, esoteric stuff. This is framing things in the context of humanity, tragedy, all this suffering. Again, it's a call to expand the use of opioids for non-malignant pain. So it turns out Scientific American's on PubMed. I didn't know that until I was writing this talk. But if you publish in that journal, it's actually in PubMed, which is pretty cool. Again, more high profile journals, authors. Therapeutic use of opioid analgesics rarely results in addiction. Again, this is not real evidence. This is all quoting that silly Porter and Jick paragraph from the New England Journal a few years before. So what we have is that there's an awareness within the medical community that there is a massive new population of chronic non-malignant pain patients who could potentially benefit from opioid therapy. So with that massive patient base, doctors are pretty smart and tend to be crafty. What do you think happened after that? Well, it turns out there's money to be made in suffering, all right, from a lot of different fronts, doctors and otherwise. And that really brings us to the opioid crisis as we know it. And the crisis unfolded in 3 waves, first, second, and third waves. First wave is really on us as doctors. Pharma and doctors working together to develop new opioid medications, and specifically the long-acting opioids, OxyContin, these long-acting formulations that were produced, marketed, advertised, and distributed with the mindset of getting patients pain relief without causing addiction. There was aggressive advertising, and there was reassurance from doctors, from industry, from medical societies that addiction risks were low. Problem, right? Again, using all this really crappy evidence out there, non-evidence really, just people saying stuff in prominent journals to reassure people, provide false reassurance that this was a safe strategy. So in 1991, when this started to really take off, opioid overdose started to rise. Again, drug companies paying doctors lots and lots of money to say these drugs are safe. OxyContin went from a 670,000 prescription drug in 1997 to 6.2 million prescriptions in 2002. That's an order of magnitude increase over a 5-year period. That is a lot of money, all right? By 1999, 86% of patients using opioids did not have cancer. Think about that. These are non-malignant pain patients. And when you have non-malignant people living a long time with these massive pill burdens being directed towards them, you have an enormous amount of drugs out there now subject to diversion. So diversion began to be a real problem. People using these drugs that they're not prescribed, right? Unfortunately, the first wave was bolstered by the professional societies, the hospitals, and the state medical boards. Even the Joint Commission hopped on board and contributed to the problem. I'm going to explain how here. 1995, the president of the American Pain Society, James Campbell, introduced pain as the 5th vital sign. All right, so when a nurse meets with a patient, takes their vitals, blood pressure, heart rate, they check the patient's pain every single time. Pain then becomes a measure of patient satisfaction, quality of hospitals, healthcare delivery, and ratings, right? So what does that mean? Is that a bad thing? Well, when you have the Federation of State Medical Boards saying that, quote, physicians should not fear disciplinary action for prescribing opioid analgesics in the usual course of professional practice, that's open season, man. If you're a doctor and you're in practice, prescribe opioids and have at it, and feel free to do it without fear of disciplinary action. Joint Commission, physicians are now mandated to assess and treat pain, or their hospitals will lose federal funding. That is a not thinly veiled threat to doctors to make your patients happy. Why? Because pain is being checked at every nurse-patient interaction. They're measuring it. And if your patients are not happy because they're in pain, your ratings go down. And when your ratings go down, your federal funding goes down per the Joint Commission. So think about how powerful a motivator that is for hospitals and doctors. So the net result was a massive pressure campaign on providers to aggressively control pain, regardless of its source. And opioids are the best tools we had at the time, because you know what? They work and they were safe, or at least so we thought. So again, doctors, pharma, professional societies, hospitals, medical boards, and even the Joint Commission, all working together to start this first wave of the opioid crisis. Second wave happened in the late 2000s as, remember the pendulum started to swing and people started to realize that all this overprescribing was a problem, and they started to do some initial efforts to crack down on prescribing. Well, now you have a whole population of Americans who are now addicted to these things, and they want to get their drugs from somewhere. And if their doctors aren't going to give them the OxyContin, they're going to turn to the streets. So they turned to tar heroin, which is this cheap and widely available drug that came from Mexico. But this is a new generation of drug dealer. I grew up in Florida, as you know, and child of the 80s. Miami Vice was my favorite show. I still love the show, right? My impression of drug dealers were these violent Colombian cartels where they just shoot everybody up and it's horrible, right? Well, in the 2000s, the Mexican cartels, much smarter. Their drug dealers were nice, they were considerate, they were market driven. They weren't trying to move cocaine into Miami. They were targeting the suburban white kids. And yes, there is an actual Twitter page called Suburban White Kid, but that's who they were targeting, direct to the kids, right? These kids don't want to be dealing with machine guns and mean people. They want someone who's going to talk nice to them, who's going to show up on time. And if they don't have the money for their drugs, it's all right, pay me tomorrow, right? These cartels were smart. They followed the dollars, and suburban white kids are where the dollars were at. And so what we saw from 2002 to 2013, almost a 300% increase in heroin deaths in America. That's a problem, all right? So the doctors got the people hooked, and then the drug dealers moved in when the drug supply started to wane, and they gave them all this cheap tar heroin. So that was the second wave. The third wave happened when synthetic opioids hit the market. And that was in kind of the mid 2000 teens, right? These are potent manufactured opioids, not tar heroin, which comes from opium. This is stuff that's built in a lab. It's basically illicitly manufactured fentanyl, synthetic fentanyl, largely from Mexico and China. And when this stuff hit the market, I mean, this stuff is 100 times more potent than morphine. So when you overdose on this, the chances of dying go up. And so what we saw is this dramatic escalation of people dying of overdoses from 2013 on, right? The sharpest increase in opioid overdose ever. In 2016, 20,000 people died in the US. And I know now this number is not such a big deal because we're 500 some thousand dead of coronavirus. But back in 2016, 20,000 dead Americans was still a big number. In fact, by 2017, more Americans died of drug overdoses than died in car accidents, which is completely insane because you know how Americans love their cars and they're never going to stop dying in car accidents. But drugs surpassed that as a cause of death. It was astonishing, actually. So again, the pendulum, the government started to respond to this. A number of things happened throughout this whole process. The legalization, approval of buprenorphine as a drug to treat addiction. The Affordable Care Act in 2010 expanded access to health insurance in general and to substance use disorder treatment specifically. So you're starting to see the government get involved here, passing laws to address these issues, increasing access to naloxone to save people's lives in the streets, expansion of prescription drug monitoring programs so that doctors can monitor whether patients are, where they're getting their opioids, are they doctor shopping, you know, that sort of thing, and making sure that they're being, you know, compliant. And then in 2016, the CDC came out with a guideline for prescribing opioids for chronic pain. And just in brief, again, this busy slide, but if you look to the very end here, the recommendation is that that patients avoid a 90 morphine milliequivalents per day total. So basically, there's a recommendation here to, if possible, limit the high dose opioid dosing regimens for patients, or carefully justify or consider referral to a specialist. But what doctors saw is avoid 90. And so what that led to is a series of forced tapering with patients.
Why, effective today, my administration is officially declaring the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under federal law, and why I am directing all executive agencies to use every appropriate emergency authority to fight the opioid crisis.
So in 2017, opioid overdose deaths exceeded car accident deaths. The CDC just released their guidelines saying to taper patients with opioids. You got President Trump saying opioids are a problem. So again, all this effort by the US government to address this problem. Again, the pendulum swing in the opposite direction. So what started to happen is you start getting states legislating opioid prescribing limits. And so here's an example of a law, the McCain-Gillibrand law. Gillibrand was my state senator in New York, and John McCain from Arizona, basically limiting all opioid prescriptions to a 7-day supply or less for any acute pain management. All right, so that's a pretty dramatic shift, right? Instead of just open season on opioids, now specific state and federal limitations. So that's a problem, right? So picture being a scoliosis surgeon and a patient with chronic pain having to operate on somebody and then discharge them, and then having them have to come back to your office every 7 days to get their opioid refills. I mean, it's a problem, right? It's a burden to neurosurgical patients. So again, doctors and the medical societies were aware of this, and there's issues with this forced opioid tapering, which again is terrible. It's bad for patients, but this is what was happening, right? So all this government and the CDC, all that had consequences. It was really hurting patients. And so meanwhile, bringing us back to neurosurgery, here we are as functional neurosurgeons with a number of different alternatives to opioids, these opioid sparing therapies, spinal cord stimulation, ablative neurosurgical therapies, even spine surgery, right? All these can help patients get off the opioids. A lot of these are being denied, right? So we're trying to help these patients, and insurers, Medicare, denying the treatments. So neurosurgeons are pretty smart. So we look at this opioid crisis as an opportunity.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. So in neurosurgery, we utilize basically every lever of power we had within the in influence we could in Washington to help shape this legislation. And my role in this, you know, I'm not a big researcher, but what I did like to do is help with healthcare policy and advocacy. And so I was president of the pain section during this time, and I spent a lot of time in the Washington committee working on these things. And Kim Birchall is the one that got me involved in the pain section. If anyone's interested, you know, pain's a great way to get active because there's always active pain issues. There's always, you know, legislation dealing with this. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, you can do it. And so I spent a better part of the 2010s digging into the weeds of the legislative process. And again,
looking at the laws, helping shape the legislation, and through the Washington Committee, trying to make changes. So again, here's the McCain-Gillibrand, the 7-day supply. We knew that was going to be terrible for neurosurgical patients. So we used neurosurgery PAC money. So we would lobby politicians. We would write letters to the administrators, to Donald Trump, to anybody who would listen, to really push the neurosurgery agenda and really try to do what was right for our patients. And so we were able to get sympathetic politicians who were powerful to actually write legislation to directly address our issues. So here was the Mark Meadows bill that, as a direct result of our lobbying efforts, said basically no more strict federal 7-day supplies. You could prescribe medications as needed for postoperative pain relief. So this right here is the sort of the direct result of our lobbying efforts that erase that major problem for neurosurgical patients, polytrauma patients, spine patients. So we got rid of that, right? And so this is just an example of a couple dozen things that we did to try to shape the legislation. We actually met with legislators as part of the Healthcare Leadership Council at a summit meeting in Washington, D.C., where actually, I say confronted, but really discussed one-on-one with Lamar Alexander, who was the chairman of the Senate Health Committee, who's actually crafting all this legislation, and Scott Gottlieb, the commissioner of the FDA, to basically plead with them to not have hard prescribing limits for neurosurgical patients or for any postoperative patient, and to directly address the limitations we're having in getting our opioid-sparing neurosurgical therapies pre-certified. And as a result of this meeting, the FDA commissioned a panel to specifically address our concerns. And Lamar Alexander promised us, to me personally and the whole group, that they were not going to have hard prescribing limits on opioids for postoperative pain patients. So in the end, we produced this white paper, which helped shape the new legislation. So our legislative sort of agenda was avoid hard limits on opioid prescribing for postoperative patients, encourage the use of evidence-based surgical treatments for pain, streamline the pre-approval process, and then optimize the use of prescription drug monitoring programs. And that's exactly what got written into the Support Act, which President Trump signed into law in 2018, again, codifying in law no opioid prescribing limits for postoperative patients. And they further included a measure that said all federally insured enrollees are made aware of opioid-sparing treatment alternatives. So again, because we pushed for these things, we got them put into this law, and it was signed into law, and it's now the law of the land. And that's very cool. And that never would have happened without neurosurgery's advocacy and effort. So again, to the residents and fellows out there and anyone interested in making a difference, depending on what you like to do, maybe it's research, maybe it's just taking care of patients, maybe it's healthcare advocacy, right? And you as an individual can actually make a difference. And if you work with the right group of people, you can really change how healthcare policy is made and laws are passed and how patients are taken care of. And again, all these efforts ultimately started to bend the curve, right? 2018, we started to see the first drop in opioid deaths since the 1990s. So, it started to work. It was very cool. So we did feel like we were making a difference. So as functional neurosurgeons, we showed that neurosurgeons are part of the solution. We weren't just part of the whole doctor thing that got us into this crisis, but we're actually helping us get out of the crisis. We demonstrated that our efforts can help reduce the need for opioid prescribing, and that functional and spine neurosurgery plays a major role here. Our surgical procedures can help patients get off the opioids, right? And so to continue these efforts, we're looking at any research that shows that supports our contention that our surgical procedures get people off the opioids. And bit by bit, these papers are coming out. And right, it's looking at not just visual analog score as a marker or an outcome for surgical success, but getting patients off the opioids. So right now we're producing a series of guidelines. We just published this guideline on ablative procedures to get patients off drugs with cancer pain. And we're currently working on the spinal cord stimulation guideline, again, looking at opioids and spinal cord stimulation. So again, these are ongoing efforts that shows that functional neurosurgery, safe and effective for chronic pain. These things are cost effective, they're evidence-based, they're opioid sparing. Yes, there are some barriers to reimbursement, but our lobbying efforts have started to chip away at that. There's an increasingly favorable political and medical landscape. And you as a doctor, right, as a young physician, a young neurosurgeon can make a difference. You can be part of this process and keep pushing these efforts forward. So today we've learned about the opioid crisis, a little bit about neurosurgery advocacy. You too can get involved if you want. And this is how functional neurosurgery is playing a role. So that's the opioid crisis. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I like telling stories. So this is the story of that. In the end, it's all about getting out and doing the things you love to do. And this is my family, and they're great. And Ryan Reynolds is hilarious. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Because in the end, this is what I want to be doing, right? As soon as COVID's over, I want to be cave diving. This is my buddy in the Bahamas. I dive with him a few times a year in these gorgeous caves. And that's what I do for fun.
That's beautiful, Dr. Winfree. That's great, amazing talk. And we're going to open it up for some questions. It's okay with you. We have a few minutes for some questions. Because beautiful talk, that illustrates. I was taking some notes, and I was just thinking about when I started my residency right around the same time as you in 1999. And I still remember as an intern being told not to worry ever to prescribe opioids to our patients with any type of cancer or any type of back pain or surgery or anything like that. We would give prescriptions left and right with absolutely no reservations, and we were encouraged to do so. And actually, we were further encouraged to tell the patients there's no proven data that you are going to get addicted to this because you did have surgery and you're battling a brain tumor, you're battling pain, you're doing all this kind of stuff. And that's what we were encouraged and expected to do. All right. I mean, this is exactly what you said. I mean, it was such a massive amount. And I think that you said that the prescriptions went from a few 100,000 prescriptions a year to millions of prescriptions.
600 to 6 million, an order of magnitude.
In just over the course of a few years. And we were right in the mix of that, myself prescribing a lot of this. So just to put it in perspective, I see questions, hands. I'm going to go to Dr. Mesquia, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Chen. Dr. Mesquia just stepped down as the chair of neurology, is an expert on stroke, Chris, and he went to Hopkins Med, and then he's been a chair here for many years. He just stepped down, and Dr. Barrett just took over the chairmanship. So Dr. Mesquia, take it away.
Sure. First of all, fantastic talk. Thanks for summarizing it. Thanks for being completely transparent of what happened during all those years, which I lived through. The fifth vital sign, the doctors don't care about suffering, the whole thing. What I observed is that people are not held accountable for their prior positions on these things. In other words, the non-MD participants in the opiate crisis who sort of stimulated the whole thing basically are never held accountable. They're on to the next fad. They're probably deciding where to give the vaccines for COVID now. They're never held accountable. So what's your thought? What are your thoughts about that? Because I just see they pay no public price, seems to me.
Well, so Purdue, right? That's the opioid company that's actually being driven. Right.
Yeah,
so that would be one exception.
Yeah, that's litigation. But the people who work for the government, Joint Commission.
Yeah, Joint Commission, right.
Yeah. And also the, Institute of Medicine, et cetera, who basically just, pounded us with fifth vital sign. Why isn't JIC famous or infamous? In other words, you give such a good insight into this. And
well, the way I think of this is I think most people had good intentions. I don't think Porter and JIC had any bad intent by producing that paragraph in the New England Journal. I mean, who writes a paragraph for the New England Journal thinking that's going to shape society's response to a medication and how that's going to form an evidence base for an entire field of medicine? Nobody does that. So I don't know that I would personally fault Porter and JIC for publishing that. I think it was a Pandora's box that that was out of control, and it was sort of out of their hands. I don't. So what would be the plan? You sort of crucify Porter and Jick by, I don't know. You gotta do what's right. I mean, and I don't.
But keep in mind, New England Journal has a responsibility too. I mean, they published it. They weren't forced to publish it.
Right. They could have put the brakes on when they saw this get out of control. They could have said, you know, we gotta, you know, this was a thing we published. This was an opinion piece, basically. This can't be the evidence base. But you're right, that as far as I know wasn't done, and that's a problem. That's, I guess, in part on the New England Journal, but is the New England Journal responsible for the entire medical community? I mean, to some degree, I don't know.
I mean, they certainly, when the opinion is a certain way, when it supports their opinion, they publish it fast track. You know, right. I just think you have to look at the bias of editorial boards too.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe that Purdue is being utilized as an example of the extreme example, right? As to what, because I think that's the way that we work in some extent in the United States. Sometimes it's difficult to find, because I look back at my own life in my own career prescribing, you know, early on as a resident. I mean, I never questioned the data. I just did it blindly. So in some ways, we as physicians, as healthcare providers, had something to do in that, you know, sort of perpetuating that kind of chain reaction that happened at the beginning. So I'm going to pivot right now to Selby, and then I'm going to ask Elir to comment. Go ahead, Selby.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much for that excellent talk. So my question is about the data on overdoses from narcotics. You showed that graph, you know, the escalating number of overdoses from opioid pain medications over the years. Do we have data on how much of that is from physician prescribed narcotics that are, you know, taken by the patients for whom they're prescribed, versus, you know, what number of those deaths are related to either narcotics that are obtained illegally or as a result of diversion from someone else?
Yeah, let me show you a slide here. Can I share my screen again real quick?
Yes, please, Chris, go ahead.
So this is about the closest I have. You guys see this graph?
Yeah, we see it well.
So here it's broken down by heroin, the natural and semi-synthetic opioids. So these are the purple line is going to be the closest thing to prescribed opioids. The orange line is heroin, and the synthetics is the black line. So yeah, this data does exist. So the blue line is what you're looking at in terms of prescribed opioids. And because those are the three big: the prescribed opioids, heroin, and the synthetics. So does that answer your question?
That does, actually. That's great data that we have there. Thank you.
That's from it's not from this talk. I just pulled that from another talk that I give. I only had 30 minutes, so I didn't want to throw too much data at you.
Of course, no, thank you.
No, thank you, Chris. That's great. I'm going to ask Elir, who's been thinking a lot about pain. He's an anesthesiologist. Chris is taking a special interest. He's published in a few papers, by the way, also in the use of anesthesia and pain and the regional blockade of local anesthetics. Otherwise, part of the problem, of course, is our poor understanding of the neuroscience behind pain as well. And Elir has been thinking of innovative ways to avoid pain in the operating room, which subsequently can actually change the way a person perceives pain. Elir, go ahead. Elir, can you hear us?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, just try and get the mic on.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winfree. That was an excellent talk. On a personal note, I am doing my scuba diving certification. I'm going to go to the Springs in a couple of weeks. Awesome. And then I'm meeting up a buddy of mine to go to Cozumel later on this year. So excellent pictures there with the cave diving. My interest anesthesia. I also did a fellowship in acute and chronic pain at Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia. So this is a topic that I also find of great interest. It's wonderful to see that the neurosurgical the practice is taking a more and more interest, like you are. Part of the issues that we face is that you can do a lot of things intraoperatively in the operating room, preoperatively, you know, the early post-operative period. I think where a lot of times when we end up seeing these patients, again, from anesthesia standpoint, it's either in the chronic pain clinic, or you end up seeing them with their own acute on chronic pain for their third back surgery, and something in between needs to happen. One area that I wanted to ask you was, of course, finding the right touch of how much pain medication, not too much, not too little. The Goldilocks spot of when to prescribe medication is one thing. But anything else in terms of other modalities of treating pain, whether it's regional anesthesia or other techniques that in your clinical practice that you guys use that find it to be helpful to reduce the need to prescribe?
Well, absolutely. So I actually teach a course on this with the AANS. So about using certain perioperative strategies to reduce opioid burden postoperatively. So things like local anesthetic injection. You know, I'm sure a lot of you, before doing a craniotomy, inject lidocaine before skin incision. You know, that's something we sort of as neurosurgeons do without thinking much about it, but there's an evidence base to back that up. And it does seem to reduce postoperative opioid burden. There's other things you can do. The lyophilized bupivacaine, Exparel, you know, you put that into wounds, or you can lay in catheters so you can sort of do these constant drug infusions in paraspinal muscles, you know, things like that. I don't do spine surgery, so I don't use this stuff, but there's data out there that shows it can reduce postoperative pain levels. There is some conflicting data about whether it reduces actual opioid addiction. I don't know that any studies powered up enough to show that, but there are definitely strategies to reduce opioid burden postoperatively. I use ketamine in almost all of my spinal cord stimulator patients to reduce, to make patients kind of less wacky during the surgery, although it can sometimes have the opposite effect, but to reduce pain levels. I mean, it can be really useful. There's you know, IV Tylenol. Even IV Tylenol has been shown to help. But again, does it reduce hospitalization? It may not, but it can reduce opioid requirements. So, you know, there's definitely things that can be done to reduce the opioid burden postoperatively. But in the end, it may come down to, in part, patients' genetics, the events in their lives that led up to the time of surgery. Like, there's certain things you don't have control over as a neurosurgeon. So you just do the best you can. And try not to put the patient in a situation where you're just flooding them with opioids postoperatively without sort of regard to do they actually need it or not. And there was a good article in the New York Times a year or two ago about an American patient who was living in Germany and had I don't know, it was a hysterectomy or something. They basically didn't give her opioids, and she realized that, you know, postoperatively she had some pain, but she just hung out for a couple of days and the pain went away, and it really wasn't all that bad. She just highlighted that, you know, Americans have this sense that all pain is evil and you have to make all pain go away. And it turns out if you're having surgery, you're gonna have some pain afterwards, and it's not the worst thing in the world. And so, you know, keeping that in mind as a prescriber is not the worst thing. So I tell my patients that they're gonna have some pain after surgery, and I don't flood them with a ton of opioids. So there's things you can do as a doctor to make an impact, I think.
And Chris, actually, Dr. Boyaji earlier has done recently published a beautiful paper in which he's precisely with evidence-based medicine. It shows that doing some maneuvers in the operating room with our patients with craniotomies, you know, they actually have reduced pain and reduced use of opiates and faster discharge from the hospital and stuff. And now we're moving those studies in a prospective manner. With same deal with the spine, actually. But right, I don't know if Gaetano is still there on the line. Gaetano, you mind telling Dr. Winfree the study that you and Kinsley are putting together with my assistants also for the awake spine surgery, and one of the outcomes that we're measuring?
Yes, sir. Good morning, Dr. Winfree, and amazing talk. So yes, we are doing some prospective studies comparing MIS TLIFs and laminectomies under general anesthesia versus spinal anesthesia. And we are seeing very promising data showing that patients that receive spinal anesthesia go home much faster, but also have less VAS pain already in the PACU, and they tend to use less opioids medications. So that can be another additional tool.
So it's type of regional anesthesia, basically, is what you're looking at. Yeah, no, it's a great thing.
Yeah.
You know, and that's one actually Gaetano and Diogo are putting right now, Chris, a PCORI grant. You know, those tend to be multi-million-dollar grants, you know, and I'm helping Kinsley, of course, and trying to make sure that we get that grant out, because I've been interested in pain from the cancer perspective, because we do have, and then we don't understand the psychological, which also influences the way your synapses work in the brain, the neuroscience behind pain, and also regional. So we're working on another grant with actually another one of our colleagues right here, where we're using nanoparticles to locally inject that have long-term delivery. And these are special new understanding of new molecules that are inhibiting certain pain pathways. Is that we still don't have a good idea which pain is central, which is peripheral, how does the brain perception of pain also influence. I think that we're at the early stages, so I'm glad that to hear your advocacy for neurosurgeons to get more involved in this, because we can do better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks. Oh, the other thing, I give a talk all over the world on medical marijuana, which is a great way of treating pain. It's opioid sparing. And there was a study that just came out. It turns out the runner's high isn't opioids, right? It turns out you can't block runner's high with naloxone. It turns out it's probably endocannabinoids. I don't know if anybody of you guys are runners, that high you get when you do an intense workout, it's probably your anandamide, which is the endogenous ligand for the endocannabinoid system. It's not opioids. It's not endorphins. It's cannabinoids. It's pretty cool. But anyway, it's a powerful drug to harness for treating pain in patients.
Amazing. Most people don't realize my very first paper coming out of UC Berkeley was in the role of the mu opioid receptor and the connection between the lateral entorhinal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, which is where you actually have drug and sex mediated reward. And that happens to be mu opioid receptor, at least one of the important receptors, actually. That was my very first paper that I was my honors thesis at UC Berkeley. And then when I was in medical school, I ended up publishing that in a peer-reviewed journal. But once again, then suddenly, as you said, it's been up and down. And I think that we need to stay very, very involved in this field. So maybe we can have you in the future committed to an in-person course here at the Simulation Center, maybe next year when the travel.
Yeah, whenever you guys want, I can teach your residents all the peripheral nerve surgery they want to know.
Yes, they would love to. The Simulation Center is beautiful. We'll coordinate that. I will ask our residents, Olu especially, to help us coordinate something for next year with Chris and ourselves right here. And then the other one is another lecture, maybe on the use of marijuana, because we're definitely a lot of interest from many, because we get asked all this question all the time by our patients. So
yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, Chris, we have at one point, we have almost 100 people. When you look at the rooms, I have multiple people here that were very interested, and we'll have your certificate sent to you. I think Andres is already coordinating that. So thank you for joining us this morning. Sorry that we took a few extra minutes, but it's fascinating talks. All right.
Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dr. Winfree. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week and join us on Friday in our course.
So am I staying on with the residents now?
Yes, I think so. I think that Andres, what's the plan right now?
Yeah, so it's the residents and fellows first, then Dr. Chen, and then you. I believe the link is different though.
Oh, okay. Would you mind staying here with Dr. Winfree and sort it out? And that way I'm going to log out because I don't have
I can log out and.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.